Thank you, Rosie. And thank you everyone for being here today. My name is Stephanie McClure and I'm the CAP director at OHSU. Today you're joining us for one of our ongoing webinar series focused on increasing knowledge and skill sets across OHSU when it comes to supporting culturally specific communities who've experienced sexual and domestic violence. Okay. I would like to just briefly mention that none of the presenters today have anything to disclose. As Rosie just mentioned, how to access the Spanish translation today, there's a little bit of written instruction here as well. There's also closed captions available if you want to click on the closed caption button or live transcript button, and then select show subtitle to view the captions throughout today's presentation. I want to take a moment to acknowledge that many of us are joining from various places across the state, but today we specifically want to acknowledge that the land that OHSU's hospital rests on is stolen traditional village sites of the Multnomah, Wasco, Cowlitz, Cathlamet, Clackamas, bands of Chinook, Tualatin, Kalapuya, Molalla, and many other tribes who made their homes along the Columbia River. We want to recognize that Portland today is a community of many diverse Native peoples who continue to live and work here. We respectfully acknowledge and honor all Indigenous communities, past, present, and future, and are grateful for their ongoing and vibrant presence. We also want to acknowledge the systemic policies of genocide, relocation, assimilation, and sexual violence that still impact many Indigenous and Native American families today. As settlers and guests on these lands, we respect our Indigenous leaders and families and pledge to make ongoing efforts to address and end the violence against Indigenous communities. Before we get going today, I want to just have a quick reminder to folks that the Confidential Advocacy Program, we have 5 regional support lines across the state of Oregon. All of those numbers are listed here, and I also want to thank all of our community-based advocacy agency partners who help us ensure that these lines are available 24/7, 365. If at any point in time during today's presentation, if you'd like to call and get support, please do so. Today on the support lines for OHSU, Stacy will be answering the phone. Many of you know Stacy. I think she's on here as well and might pop up at some point. You can also reach out to us if you would like to through our CAP support at ohsu.edu email. Our mission at CAP is really to center the voices of those who've experienced sexual misconduct, including sexual harassment, stalking, sexual violence, or intimate partner violence through education, advocacy, empowerment, connection, and support. We do this work by employing our values and our services, structures, and actions. We recognize that all forms of violence and domination are linked and cannot be addressed individually. Every situation is unique and requires an equitable response that is driven by the survivor because they are the expert in their own life. We know that trauma impacts our ability to fully participate at school, work, and negatively impacts our health. And at CAP, we are committed to supporting participants in our programs and our services and making the right choices for them and advocating against and addressing the systemic and individual barriers that they face so that they can continue to move towards their goals and aspirations. One of our I'm realizing the slides are not progressing. One of our most commonly known resources that was helped develop by Dr. Karen Eden is our Respect for All app. There is a link that you can find it at ohsu.respectforall.com to download this app. We've found that it has been very helpful for folks to understand various institutional systems at OHSU, whether that be reaching out for the first time to try to find out about your rights, about resources like CAP, reporting information, as well as connecting through community-based resources that might address needs that folks have. For folks who have not experienced violence, but maybe are trusted individuals that survivors go to for support, this app can also be very helpful for you, and we highly recommend that all OHSU supervisors, faculty as well download this app and look through it, because it also helps you recognize and understand what your obligations are under OHSU policy when it comes to potentially reporting if you get a disclosure, and provides you with some guidance on how best to handle these situations to ensure that you're not contributing to additional trauma that somebody has experienced. Some of the resources that we offer at CAP right now include trauma-informed yoga. This is a resource that folks can access on our website at any time, day or night. We also provide art therapy resources to folks. For this particular program, you do need to actually reach out to us because we want to ensure folks have support as they're going through the program. But we can give you a link that will allow you to access all the various videos online for that. We also provide comprehensive advocacy support services to folks. So as I mentioned, we have our hotline services that are available 24/7. We're here to listen, to affirm, and to validate. We're also here because often we find at OHSU, as I mentioned earlier, that violence impacts our everyday experience, and it may impact our ability to fully participate in class if we're a student, or in our ability to ensure that we're able to just go through our day at work every day and not be impacting that. So a lot of the things that we do at OHSU are focused on helping to provide interventions, ensuring folks understand their rights, and all employees under Oregon law have a right to ask for safety and support measures, and under Title IX students as well. And we're here to help coordinate those things to decrease the impacts, the negative impacts that that violence has on your life as it relates to your time at OHSU. Lastly, we also do help, and I think most commonly folks know that we do support folks who decide to make a report to OHSU. And I want to acknowledge that many of the folks that we support maybe don't feel that that is something that they would like to do. And we have a lot of support services that we can provide outside of that. But for those who are interested in reporting, we are here to ensure that you understand your rights. We're here to accompany you if you would like to and from the meetings that you go to throughout that investigation process. We're here to advocate for you throughout that process and ensure that you are supported. Lastly, we have a program called Rising Voices, which some of you may have heard about as well. This is a relatively new program that we started as we started to realize there are various trends noticing across the institution with barriers that folks were experiencing when coming forward to get support around these issues. And Rising Voices really is here for us to amplify the experiences, the stories, the barriers that folks are experiencing across the institution, as well as to identify solutions to those barriers and improvements that we can make across OHSU, whether that be at an institutional level or even just at a community departmental level, to better support survivors. And with that, I want to take a moment now to introduce our speaker, Ayana Wallace. We're so grateful for you to be here, Naya. Mrs. Wallace worked for over a decade and has worked for over a decade in the domestic violence field. She has been instrumental in the national implementation of the lethality assessment program that has served as a lead trainer for the Maryland Network Against Domestic Violence. She's extensively studied the theory and implications of privilege, oppression, and intersectionality. She's a writer, a poet, an animal advocate, and a mom of 2 fur babies. Thank you so much, Anaya. We really appreciate your time today.
Hi, thank you so much. Hi, good afternoon, everyone, or morning there. My name is Ayana Wallace. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the training manager with Ujima Inc. We are the National Center on Violence Against Women in the Black Community. one of very few nationally designated culturally specific resource centers. So if you've ever heard of Esperanza United, who was formerly Casa de Esperanza, or if you've ever worked with the Asian Pacific Institute on gender-based violence, there are two great resource centers as well. And they focus on, of course, their respective communities. And we focus on Black women and girls addressing the needs, realities, lived experiences, challenges, barriers, strengths of Black women and girls, and also of the Black community as a whole. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Move some things around. And so there are a couple things I definitely want to say before we get going, just as a good background for me, who I am, and how we're gonna be in space together. Definitely want to encourage folks to turn on their videos if you feel comfortable, if you're feeling brave today, if you're able, based on your internet capacity, just turn it on and be in space. If not, feel free to keep your cameras off and just make sure to participate in the chat as much as possible. So again, my name is Ayana Wallace. I am the training manager with Ujima. We're a national resource center, and my background is in women's and gender studies. I have both my undergraduate and graduate degrees in women's and gender studies. And my concentration was in health and sexuality, which allowed me to do a lot of things with that. But my specific area of focus was in violence in communities of color, specifically intimate partner violence, sexual violence, again, because of my major, a lot around medicalized racism, but looking at institutional and systemic violence as a whole against communities of color, and then really thinking about how do we do cross-community collaboration, allyship, and social justice work. So I entitled this workshop, She's Too Strong, Understanding the Intersections of Misogynoir, Domestic Violence, and Victimization, really as a way to get us thinking about what does intersectionality actually look like? What's the impact of it? And why is it really important to narrow in on not only understanding someone's intersecting identities, but then being able to understand the intersecting forms of violence that they will experience because of those different identities. So after grad school, I went and I worked in a domestic violence shelter as a case manager for several years. I saw a lot of amazing work done, met amazing survivors, worked with some very challenging survivors, and also saw a lot of very glaring systems gaps and actually very violent systems responses, especially directed towards survivors of color and especially directed towards Black women in particular. So after some time in shelter doing direct service work, I went over to the Maryland Network Against Domestic Violence, where originally I joined the national training team. So as part of the lethality assessment program, I was going out across the country, working with law enforcement and domestic violence service providers and community-based partners on how to actually implement a high lethality protocol, and then how to best respond to survivors who are in intimate danger of being murdered by their partner, but also how to support programs when they're working with survivors of color who are also in intimate danger of being murdered. So after some time on that team, I then went to the actual Maryland training team, where I worked my way up to become the lead trainer for the state team before coming to Ujima, where I've been for over 2 years now. And so all of that to say, I definitely bring in a lot of my personal lived experiences as a Black woman, but also bring in a lot of the voices and experiences of Black women that I've worked with, who are not only survivors, but are allies and advocates as well. And so we're gonna go ahead and keep moving forward. Again, a quick background about our program or about our resource center. Our mission and vision. Our vision is to create a world where Black women and girls are valued, respected, safe, and free from violence. Our mission is to mobilize our entire community to respond to and end violence at the intersections, and then to really serve as a resource to not only survivors of violence, but to be a resource for advocates, for community partners, and for the general community as well. So we'll go out and we'll talk to hairstylists. we'll talk to barbers, we'll talk to community elders, we'll talk to community-based programs, really anyone who is dedicated to ending violence against women and girls and violence against Black women and girls especially. So some of the work that we always try to do, or a lot of the framing that we try to give in terms of our work, is to make sure to always give voice back to Black women and girls who are largely silenced in our society, to provide a supportive community, and then to engage all persons in our community. So women, men, children, folks in the LGBTQIA community, folks who are gender nonconforming. We really acknowledge that you can't leave anyone out when we're doing community-based work and when we're doing intersectional work. And then some of the strategies that we actually use to do our work include policy and legislation. We have some senior policy attorneys on staff that are constantly on the Hill, working with staffers, making sure they're getting new stats, new data, new information, making sure they're understanding things like why are pronouns important to talk about and what does it mean to affirm someone's identity. We have a research and evaluation work group where it's actually comprised of a good amount of professors and theorists across the country, where they come together to produce what we call our Black papers on anything from gun violence and lethality in the Black community to Black maternal mortality and the intersections with IPV, even to hair politics in the Black community. So supporting new legislation and really new narratives about Black hair, but even to acknowledge in 2021, we have natural hair legislation on the books, which is called the Crown Act, because it is often the case where people of color and especially Black women can be fired for having natural hair in the workplace. So we also do a lot around outreach, capacity building, education and public awareness and training, where we have our training and technical assistance team, where we might come out for a workshop like this, or we might show up at a conference or even have our community-based conversation. So we have a coffee and conversation series that we love. And we've talked about everything from is online dating a viable option in the face of misogynoir? What does help seeking look like for Black women in Texas? How are Black men able to both express and receive love in our society? So we're able to talk about a lot of different themes, and really, as long as they intersect with Black women, we're able to talk about a lot. So if you're ever interested in having another conversation or coming out and joining us, feel free to be in that space with us. And then we have some specific areas of focus, which include sexual violence, domestic violence, community violence, sex and labor trafficking, and institutional and structural violence as a whole. So really all the things and how they intersect in Black women and girls' lives, but these specifically are areas of focus. And I have some quick workshop agreements that I always try to start out with, just because it's a good reminder for how we'll be in space and how we'll operate in space together. Number one, active listening. It's really easy when we're virtual to get distracted by those 5 emails that are coming through or like deadlines that are getting pushed up. But as much as possible, please just try to be in space and be in community together so that we can have this really important conversation. Be present, silence that internal chatter. So my mom always says, I know you hear me, but are you listening? And that's because she knows when she might be telling me something that I might disagree with or might want to push back on. I might stop listening fully and deeply to what she's trying to actually express to me, and I'll start to craft my rebuttal instead. So just be present. Also be open. Remember that all of us are coming into this space with different lived experiences, different expectations, different realities, different understandings of even language. And so give each other some space and be open. Similarly, push through your growing edge. So if something seems really basic and like, why are we going over this to you? Just remember that for other folks, this might be completely new information, and that's okay. Respectfully challenge each other. We do not all have to agree, but if we disagree, let's do it respectfully and let's do it as really communally as we can. Lean in and lean out. We'll really just go ahead and lean in for this session. We only have a short amount of time to be in space together, and so let's use the time wisely. And then the most important is probably to continue to have these conversations, because there's no point in us being in this workshop or even going through a series of workshops together if the information and the conversations just stay here. And so if anyone has anything they would like to expand on or add to our workshop agreements, feel free to put it in the chat. And I'm going to go ahead and keep us going for our content. So this is also where I want to give a disclaimer, a reminder, a gentle hug, whatever you want to call it. Please make sure to take care of yourself in this session. Although you might do this work, you might be in anti-violence work, you might use this language all the time. It's really important to make sure that whenever you're making sure to take care of yourself. So make sure you're breathing, make sure you're drinking your water, grab a snack if you need it, grab a blanket if you need it, get up and walk away and come back. Whatever you need to do, just do that. Oh, that's twice. So I always take a very intentional moment to honor Black women throughout the diaspora, Black women whose blood courses through my veins, stolen African women whose blood courses through my veins, Black women who were told they're too ghetto or too strong or too undeserving or too whatever, but somehow still made it and are still making it. And so this is a poem it's an excerpt of a poem by Marie Evans. It's entitled, I'm a Black Woman. And I'm just gonna go ahead and read it through and then keep going. So, all right. I'm a Black woman. The music of my song, some sweet arpeggio of tears, is written in a minor key, and I can be heard humming in the night. I saw my mate leap screaming to the sea, and I with these hands cupped the life breath for my issue in the canebrake. I lost Nate's swinging body in a rain of tears and heard my son scream all the way from Anzio for peace he never knew. I learned Da Nang and Pork Chop Hill in anguish. Now my nostrils know the gas and these trigger-tired fingers seek the softness in my warrior's beard. I am a Black woman, tall as a cypress, strong, beyond all definition still, defying place and time and circumstance. Assailed, impervious, indestructible, look on me and be renewed. And so another thing that you'll quickly recognize about me is I look down a lot, and it's because I have my notes here, because I actually get really excited about being in space to have these conversations. I can definitely go on tangents, but I'm going to try to not do that for this session as much as possible. But let's go ahead and jump into our content. So I wanted us to start with the language just simply of misogynoir and what it is, and like really get into thinking about what it is, how it shows up, how it impacts Black women, and how it impacts our communities and society as a whole. So misogynoir is a term that was coined by queer Black feminist and scholar Moya Bailey back in 2010 to describe the specific ways in which racism and misogyny combine to oppress Black women. So the way I think about misogynoir is, how does misogyny and Black womanhood collide? What is the impact? What is the ripple effect? Who is really left in the wake? So here's a definition, but like really thinking about what is it? How does it show up in society? How does it impact Black women? Give me some examples, either in the chat or feel free to take yourself off of mute. So either in the chat or off of mute. What is misogynoir? What does it look like? And I'll give some examples why folks are typing. To me, misogynoir is very clearly Don Imus back in 2004, feeling entitled enough to call the Black women on the Rutgers basketball team nappy-headed hoes on live radio. It is the constant and still very ongoing attacks of former First Lady Michelle Obama, who was called everything from ugly to mannish to classless to ghetto to uneducated, even though she is one of the most educated first ladies we've ever had in our histories. It's Jasmine Heatley in 2018 being arrested after she sat on the floor of the social benefits building when she was trying to apply for social benefits. She was arrested after sitting on the floor with her toddler after standing for several hours being there. I saw some more comments come through. Stereotypes like the mammy and the sapphire, we'll get into that. When individuals say that they don't date Black women because of X, Y, and Z, justifying it as their preference, absolutely. The hypersexualization of Black women and girls, yes. The way Black congresswomen are treated in Congress, absolutely. Really thinking about the difference between aggressive and assertive and how Black women are typically seen as aggressive. Being surprised to see a Black woman in a position of power, yes. We had some more. The welfare queen trope, yeah, we'll absolutely get into that. Ignoring pain and suffering because you can take it. There's a whole, I mean, it's still very ongoing, which is why you'll see Black women across any socioeconomic class dying at high rates because of things like Black maternal mortality and the intersections of implicit bias, right? There's a whole, people even in 2021 still think Black women don't have the same number of pain receptors that white women have, and so we don't feel pain in the same way. Like there are doctors that are currently treating patients that have this thought. Let's see. Tone policing generally of Black women, absolutely. Michelle Obama being healthy and in shape after being criticized. Oh, and being criticized for showing her bare arms and wearing a dress with no sleeves. Refusing to give Black women pain medication. My cousin was just in a really horrible accident, and they didn't give her really any pain medicine. They told her to go home and take Tylenol. And she was like in a really serious accident. Not allowing Black girls and women to wear their natural hair. Absolutely. Like I have locks, and in 2021, I could be fired from certain jobs for simply having locks. Let's see. Yeah, when actors like Pompeo talk over Shonda Rhimes, Viola Davis, Kerry Washington, maternal mortality rates are higher for Black women, absolutely. Objecting to choices in jewelry, patients refusing care from POC, seeing Black girls as adultified and denying them a childhood, making fun of Zendaya when she wore locks to the Oscars a few years ago. Yeah, like the list goes on and on. It's the fact that Serena Williams gets drug tested at higher rates than her competitors because people can still not conceptualize that she's so great without extra advancements, right? Like it's all of that. And so I want us to really do some more framing to think about why and where misogynoir has happened, where it continues to show up. So I wanted us to think about it in two ways. First, the concept of rape as it's been applied to Black women, and we'll have some examples that we'll go through. So talking about the reality of slave rape and breeding farms, talking a little bit around Sally Hemmings and what happened to her and hundreds and thousands of other Black women, sexual terror and lynching during the Jim Crow era and civil rights decades, birth control testing and forced sterilization, a little bit around Centoya Brown, a little bit around missing girls in DC and really beyond, and thinking about sex work and stigma. And then we'll also narrow in a little bit more. Well, really it's going to be just a quick touch. It's just going to be just a quick glimpse into labor work and the truth around government handouts. So the reality of slave rape was that it was pervasive. No Black woman was either exempt from being raped or from the constant threat of rape. There's this misconception or this narrative, and I've heard it from other Black people, where folks will say, well, Ayana, you're lighter skinned, so you would have been better off during slavery because you would have been in the big house instead of in the field picking cotton. But the reality is, one, I would have still been a slave. And two, I would have, in the big house, just been in that closer proximity to my rapist. And so it's really interesting that a major piece of what built and really allowed slavery to thrive was breeding farms. And that's a major piece of our history.
To get them to make an informed decision.
Oh, okay. That's a major piece of our history that's left out. And so breeding farms were specifically designed spaces to perpetuate the business of slavery, because that's really what it was. On breeding farms, Black women were forced to have sex with whoever was available, and were often encouraged or really expected to maintain a quota of successful good stock pregnancies. A slave owner would say, "Mammy, bear 10 to 15 to 20 good stock babies and you might get your freedom. Mind you, I'm going to take that child because it's my property. I'm going to beat it. I'm going to work it day and night. I might rape that daughter or your son, and I might sell it, but you might get your freedom. Like that's the promise that Black women were given on breeding farms, if that. And so when I say whoever was sexually available, that's what I mean. Black mothers were at many times forced to have sex with several different men, and that could have included their own brothers, cousins, uncles, their own male children. And so to think about the history of language and the violent history behind our language sometimes, this is literally where the term mother effer comes from. And so again, to really think about what that means psychologically or the impact even that could have on communities or on people is something to pay attention to. Anybody know who Sally Hemmings is and can put it in the chat or quickly say it on mute? Who's Sally Hemmings? What's a little bit about her story? Laurie?
Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Oh, thank you. She was the half-sister of Thomas Jefferson's wife because they both had the same father. But Sally Hemings was enslaved and Thomas Jefferson's wife was not. And she went with Jefferson to France when I think she was about 14. She and another person that was enslaved went with him, and she didn't really want to come back to the United States, but he promised her that she might get freedom or that he'd be, oh, I'm sorry, I misspoke. She was pregnant by him, and she didn't really want to come back, but I think being a young person, a teenager, she was probably scared to be away from her mother when she gave birth, and he convinced her to come back. I think if I remember correctly, he promised freedom or eventual freedom for her children. And anyway, she did come back, and she had several of his children. And there's kind of a romantic idea that somehow because she came back or because he bought her nice clothes, that maybe it was consensual.
Thank you, Laurie. So, and I'm going to
Yeah.
stop you there. So you gave us a lot of great context. So I think it's really important to acknowledge that there is this romanticized narrative about their relationship, but the end all be all is she was a child sex trafficking victim of a former sitting president. Like that's the story. It wasn't that, and again, I think because we want to see good, we want to have this romanticized vision, there was no option for her to decide whether or not she was going to have his children. There was no option for her to decide whether or not she was going to come and go. He was her slave master, and that was really it. To really think about it, and again, put it in more context, she herself was a child of slave rape. She was related to one of his relatives, and she was basically passed down in the will or given as property. She was also kept locked in a brick windowless bedroom attached to his bedroom because, again, she needed to be sexually available to him. And again, when we, and history, not we as individuals, when history says, oh, she was his mistress, she was his maid, she was someone that loved him, we're really, again, ignoring the fact that in reality, the simple fact is she was a child sex trafficking victim of a former sitting president. And this, her story is not her story alone. It happened to women all across the country. It happened to women over decades, over centuries. And we really need to narrow in on incidents like this and really unpack the narratives that are behind it. Because absolutely, like Laurie was saying, she absolutely did bear several of his children. It's in some notes where it was between 6 and 8 births that she actually birthed children, right? And so to think about what that means for a legacy of unpacking all of this history, I think the two sides of the families actually met a few years ago, and it was documented. And they really had to unpack what this means for our history, what this means for understanding is about Black women's autonomy and about Black women's ability to say no and about consent, and really even thinking about our histories around trauma. So, and of course, sexual terror didn't stop when slavery ended. Rape has and continues to be used as a weapon of terror against the minds and bodies of people generally, but we're narrowing in on Black folk right now. The rape of Black women, largely by white men, continued going mostly unpunished throughout the Jim Crow era. As Reconstruction collapsed and Jim Crow took its place, white men would abduct and rape or gang rape Black women with alarming regularity. White men would often lure Black women and girls to their homes with the promise of stable work and reasonable pay, and then would assault them as they worked in the home as nannies or as caregivers. White men largely would kidnap and rape Black women on their way to and from work, home, church, school, really as a way to reinforce the racial and economic hierarchies that existed at the time. So when I think about this period, what I tend to say is, as lynching was to Black men at this time, rape was to Black women. Not to say that Black men didn't experience sexual violence as a particular aspect of the lynching process, nor to say that Black women weren't lynched, because that absolutely is the case. But overwhelmingly at this time, rape was to Black women as lynching was to Black men. And we saw this very clearly in the case of Recy Taylor, who I think her story is still available on Hulu, and it might be still available on Netflix. But she was an Abbeville native who was kidnapped and raped by 6 knife-wielding, gun-toting white men as she walked home from church on September 3rd, 1944. The NAACP actually assigned activist Rosa Parks to investigate the case, but it never went to trial because an all-white male grand jury refused to indict the men. The Alabama legislature actually apologized for the miscarriage of justice in 2011, but between 2011 and 1944, there was no justice. And again, what does that really mean to apologize what does that mean for my justice? And again, I think her documentary is on Netflix or Hulu still. And so what's thought of as one of the championing moments for the women's rights movement was the access to birth control, and the pill in particular. Approximately a third of women currently taking contraceptive measures rely on the pill, but the majority of us have really no idea of its dark past. So before the pill was marketed and then distributed to white American women as a symbol of independence and bodily autonomy, it was tested on the bodies of brown and Black women in Hawaii, Puerto Rico, psych wards, prisons, jails, urban cities, largely resulting in mass sterilization, major birth defects, and other major reproductive issues. Many poor women of color were either coerced or forced into taking the pill or the Depo-Provera shot before that was marketed and regulated, and then were prevented from stopping taking the medication despite experiencing severe bleeding, cramping, and miscarriage. Many women delivered what were called jellyfish babies because they were born with very translucent skin and without bones. And so the history of testing on Black women's bodies is why you'll sometimes hear folks from even within the Black community say things like, oh, birth control is Black genocide, or even name things like, oh, Planned Parenthood is Black genocide, because they may have taken a small piece of that history, really scaled it down. But what Black women actually need when we look at our history is bodily autonomy and the ability to make our own reproductive choices. Who's Centoya Brown? I hope some folks have heard her name. If not, I wouldn't be surprised, but who's Centoya Brown? in the chat. Anybody heard of her? What happened to her?
She was a victim of child sex trafficking, and I believe she shot her attacker and was convicted of murder, but not considered in like self-defense. Like she was just tried as an adult, I believe, and was in jail for quite some time.
Yeah, thank you. And some other folks added in as well. So absolutely right. She was a 15-year-old girl who was charged and convicted as an adult, who received a life sentence after she shot and killed the man that had bought her for the night for sex. And she testified that it wasn't the first time that he had purchased her for sex, that he purchased her from her trafficker, whose nickname is Cutthroat. I always put that in there because at 30-something years old, if I were to currently be trafficked by someone named Cutthroat, I don't think I would know what to do either. And I don't think I would just be, happy to just, resign myself to say, oh, it's okay. No. But she wasn't looked at as a victim. She wasn't given sanctuary. She was tried and convicted as an adult at 15, 16 years old and received a life sentence. And it's absolutely a new-ish story. She was in jail for over 15 years of her life. Or she was in jail for 15 years. She initially went up for parole and they told her, no, you need to sit in jail till at least until you're in your 50s before we let you go and feel that justice was served. But again, we know that the law says any person engaged in sex work, whether it be commercial, whether it be they claim that they are prostituting themselves, any type of sex work engagement under the age of 18 can be considered a sex trafficking victim. So why was that not applied to her? And why was she looked at as a willing participant? Why was she looked at as someone who was just a murderer and a thief? Because she tried many, many, many times over the years, especially, and maintained her innocence and maintained I really did it in self-defense. But again, that narrative of victimhood was not given to her. And her story, again, is not her story alone. It's happening to Black girls all over the country who are being trafficked, who are being incarcerated, and being further criminalized for it. Anybody heard about what's going on in DC with the missing girls in DC? Or really the missing girls all across the country, but DC in particular? So this story was really interesting because it actually came to light when in a 2-week span, over 10 children of color went missing from the district area with very little national media attention. DC at this point has logged well over 500 plus cases of missing juveniles, the majority being Black and Latinx. In 2014, an FBI crime stat said that nearly 40% of all missing persons under the age of 18 were Black. And that's important to think about in regards to our population size, right? But 40% of confirmed and missing juveniles are Black. Natalie Wilson, the co-founder of the Black and Missing Foundation, says, we noticed that a lot of African-American children that go missing are initially classified as runaways. They don't get an Amber Alert or media coverage. And in 2016, an estimated 1 out of 6 endangered runaways reported to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children were likely sex trafficking victims. Of those, 86% had been in the care of social services or the foster care system. So there's a couple things happening here, right? One, we already know there's an overrepresentation of Black children in the foster care and social services system. 2, we're saying that it's most likely that 1 out of 6 endangered runaways is most likely a sex trafficking victim. And folks are saying that when Black children go missing, we're most likely runaways. So why are folks not putting all these things together to say, if we're saying Black children are going missing, and we know they're most likely runaways, or we're calling them runaways, and we know 1 out of 6 is most likely a sex trafficking victim, and we know 40% of sex trafficking victims are Black, where's the outrage? Like, why are people not looking into these things? Why are people not looking into the trends all across the country where this is happening all across the country? Little Black children are going missing and people aren't batting an eye. And in 2016, and I want to make sure that we're narrowing in again on the concept of rape as it's been applied to Black women, because really it hasn't been applied to Black women, because historically we've been demeaned and viewed as subhuman. We've been viewed as property. How can you rape something that belongs to you, right? Because we're not giving bodily autonomy and the ability to consent, because systems have been set up the way they have been. Really think about the relationship that Black women have with sexuality and with being seen as vulnerable or not. So in 2016, Oklahoma City police officer Daniel Holtzclaw was convicted of 18 out of 36 counts, including 4 counts of first-degree rape and 4 counts of forced oral sodomy, after intentionally preying on Black women over a 6-month span the year prior. Holtzclaw intentionally chose one of the city's poorest neighborhoods to prey on women from within the community, with the assumption that the victim's drug and or prostitution records would undermine any investigation or claims against him. 13 of his victims actually testified against him and ranged in age from a 17-year-old girl to a 57-year-old grandmother. One 24-year-old victim who had been intoxicated when Holtzclaw arrested her testified that he transferred her to the hospital with the promise of dropping the charges if she went in for detox. But then as she laid handcuffed and restrained to her hospital bed, he then raped her. And following the assault, he then used police resources and social media to continue to stalk and harass her. So there was very little national media attention on this case, but it was actually a major victory for Black women who typically don't see this justice and definitely don't see it when it's someone whose system's involved. And so that gets us to really thinking about what then has the impact been of labor, work, and government handouts. And we're just going to get into this really quickly. But there's something I have to be very, very clear on, something I do not argue ever. Black women have always worked, whether it was in the field or as a nanny in a white family's home, or as a school teacher or a factory worker. Black women have never actually been allowed to be lazy, as a racist stereotype would have you believe. So when we talk about welfare and housing and work, a lot comes up for folks. A lot of people talk about how the breakdown of the traditional American family structure has been the root cause of Black poverty. But when we really think about the historical context surrounding Black families have never actually been allowed to be quote unquote traditional in the American sense. And with that explanation, we're not only placing blame on Black families and on Black people for experiencing or navigating or surviving poverty and oppression, we're also really overlooking the historical context of Black women workers and the impact that government programs like the welfare system have had on communities as a whole. So until 1968, the nation's primary welfare program, which was entitled Aid to Families with Dependent Children, would regularly deny benefits to families if an adult male was in the home, or an adult male child even. They would often conduct midnight raids where they would literally go out at midnight, at 1 o'clock, at 2 o'clock in the morning, and knock on folks' doors to see if an adult male was in the home. And if they found an adult male in the home, they would automatically terminate the family's benefits. So with continued discriminatory housing and employment practices also impacting and affecting Black men's ability to find and maintain reasonable work and wages and housing, really, Black women were further pushed into the role of family breadwinner and into the role of head of household, where Black men were sometimes entirely pushed out of the household just so that the family could survive with the little benefits that the government was providing at the time. There's also a lot more stigma attached to single Black mothers, for instance, than there is against single white mothers. Real estate agents knew this, and as what they called was a form of block busting, they would hire Black folks from the projects or the ghettos to walk up and down the street of mixed neighborhoods to encourage white homeowners to move out of the city and into the suburbs, while then simultaneously preventing Black homeowners from leaving the city with things like redlining. So ghettos were intentionally created. People just don't like to think about the word or think about the impact it has, because we know what happened with the Holocaust and we know what happened with our Jewish brothers and sisters. And so that would really force us to think about some of the parallels that have happened to Black communities as well. And so racialized sexual tropes definitely emerged during the slave eras, but have continued to be perpetuated and passed down from generation to generation. And not perpetuated and passed down simply by Black people, but from all people, right? And we've seen the evolution of many of these different tropes, but to really think of, we really need to think about how they have impacted Black women. So the myth of the overbearing matriarch, the mammy, and the Jezebel images all came directly out of slavery. The overbearing matriarch was seen as just that, as overbearing, drove men away, was a workhorse, could reproduce, but wasn't desirable. The mammy, I always think Shirley Temple era, but she's seen as the happy slave, loved to serve, happy with her station in life. Basically, she's happy being a servant, a maid, a slave. And she was seen as generally asexual, even though she was then the person tasked with, or even so, she was then the person tasked with breastfeeding the plantation owner's babies before she was allowed to breastfeed her own children. And then we have the Jezebel. She is typically seen as hypersexual, sexually available and indiscriminate, flirtatious, typically seen as having more Eurocentric features, so lighter skin, softer hair textures or more straight hair textures, more Eurocentric facial features even, but doesn't always have to be. But again, she was sexually available, indiscriminate, flirtatious, and so whatever physical or sexual violence was enacted upon her body, she deserved it because she was too wanton, she was too loose, she was too promiscuous, and that's what she deserved. And then we have the images of the welfare queen, the sapphire, and the Black superwoman, which all came later, closer to the civil rights movement and the war on drugs. We have the welfare queen, who is seen as lazy, scamming the system, doesn't want to work, but wants to be a baby making machine. The sapphire, she's sort of the neo-Jezebel image, but she's seen as loud, angry, exploits men for money. This is where the gold digger trope comes from. And then the Black superwoman, really from this list, seemingly the most positive. She can, will, and wants to do it all. Doesn't need a man, doesn't need a partner, doesn't need anyone because she'll figure it out. She's resilient, she's strong. Again, seemingly the most positive, but it's actually very limiting for Black women who are then not seen as vulnerable, not seen as someone who needs help, not seen as a victim even. And so even when it's positive, it can still be very limiting. And then the overarching trope that can be applied to any Black women at any time, no matter their tone even, is the angry, bitter Black woman, where the moment you push back or stand up for yourself or speak up for others, you're automatically labeled angry and bitter. And it's really a way that people silence Black women or attempt to silence Black women. And so to think about how these tropes have been applied to folks that you work with, have been applied to survivors that you serve, are applied to Black women on a societal scale anyways, and to really think about the impact that it could have for Black women, knowing that, hey, maybe I shouldn't speak up, or hey, maybe I shouldn't give my whole truth because I don't want to be called a Jezebel, or I don't want to be called a sapphire, or I don't want to be called a welfare queen, right? So to understand that these labels, even when we don't prescribe to them, that they're prescribed to us. And it really has some long lasting and traumatic impacts even. And this is what I call the Black woman child, but really to think about how Black girls in particular are sexified, adultified, sexualized. There's a really great resource that was produced by Georgetown Law from the Center of Poverty and Inequality, and it's entitled Girlhood Interrupted, the Erasure of Black Girls' Childhood. And this study really, for the first time, provided data that shows that adults view Black girls as less innocent and more adult-like than their white peers, especially beginning in the age range of 5 to 14. And they actually went back and redid this study. And I think now they say beginning as early as age 3, Black girls are viewed as in the following ways. So again, beginning at age 3, Black girls become viewed as needing less nurturing, needing less protection, needing to be supported less, comforted less, as more independent, as knowing more about adult topics, and knowing more about sex. Now, how innately would a 3-year-old Black child automatically know more about sex than her white peer? Like, why? Like, how does that make sense? Because I know I didn't. I know there are a lot of assumptions that were put on me and a lot of commentary that was put on me that I had no idea what people were even talking about, right? Or the assumption that, oh, Black girls are just little women. Or I love this meme down here. Black girls are regularly blamed for experiencing puberty early as if the presence of her body alone is consent. Hashtag fast tail girls. And that's really commentary on the fact that when Black girls, and especially if we develop early, we are automatically assumed to be promiscuous. We are automatically assumed to be more wanting to engage in sexual activity as being more grown or being too fast. And so to really understand what that means in terms of victimization and what Black girls can experience is not only related to the school to prison pipeline and how Black girls are disciplined at higher rates than their peers, but it's definitely related to the fact that predators know this. They know that other adults view Black girls in the following ways. And so they use that to their advantage, and they use that to assault and victimize little Black girls. And they do it really without any repercussions because folks, again, think that Black girls know more about sex. They think Black girls are more adult. They think Black girls are more grown and need to be comforted less and need to be checked on less. So predators use that to their advantage, which is why we have folks like R. Kelly who went decades and decades victimizing Black girls all across the country without repercussions, or people literally turn their eye to it or turn their back to it, right? So some stats and facts that are specific to Black women and girls include the fact that 41% of Black women have experienced physical violence by an intimate partner during their lifetimes. Between 40 and 60% of Black women report being subjected to coercive sexual contact by the age of 18. So before they were 18, between 40 and 60% of Black women report that they were subjected to some type of sexual contact. In the US, almost 40% of Black women have experienced sexual violence other than rape during their lifetimes. 40% of confirmed sex trafficking survivors in the US are Black. And again, think about that in relationship to our population size in this country. The average age for Black female homicide victims is 5 years younger than the average age for other women. 43% of domestic violence survivors that are arrested along with their abusive partners or as a result of a complaint lodged by their abusive partners were living below the poverty line. 66% of that 43% were Black or Latino. And then Black women ages 25 to 29 are 11 times more likely as white women in the same age group to be murdered while pregnant or in the first year after childbirth. Now, all of this being said, does not mean that Black men, Black communities are inherently more violent than other folks. That's not what I'm saying. What I am saying, though, is that when Black women experience violence, we're not taken seriously, we're not viewed as victims, we're not getting services that are culturally appropriate and respectful and humble. We're not able to access spaces where we're able to feel safe and feel brave to tell our entire story. And so what that really means is there's a lot of work to be done to make sure that we're changing these numbers, that Black women aren't dying earlier and we're not dying as violently as we have in the past and continue to really experience. And so as we continue to delve into and really think about privilege and power and identity, we also have to really acknowledge the relationship or the connections between identities and various systems or various power structures. So let's start with this, and feel free to put it in the chat, or again, take yourselves off of mute. If we could draw up, or if we could design the archetype of the norm, so the most normalized person in American society, what would that person look like? How would they show up in the world? So in the chat, or take us off of mute. Who's the most normalized person in our society? What do they look like? What identities do they hold? All right, I say cisgendered, heterosexual, male, white, Christian, able-bodied, employed, might be a father, or at least has the ability to have children, right? Christian, middle age, maybe, upper middle class, college educated, or at least graduated high school. Who we tend to see on TV sometimes. What else? What makes someone the norm? Who is the most normalized person? No mental health, neurotypical, attractive, English speaking, and generally without an accent, even though we know certain accents are seen as more acceptable than others, right? Might be a beautiful, pure white woman. Anything else we can think of? Assertive, confident, housed, so housing stable, absolutely. Most likely own a home. US citizen. No disability. Thin. All right. So we notice that box gets more and more narrow as we list out other identities. But generally, those things, no childhood trauma, love that you added that in there. But generally, that's who's considered the norm, even though we know most of us don't really look like that, right? But if that's the norm, what then happens to everybody else? If that very narrow box is considered the norm, what happens to everybody else? You might experience trauma, you might be erased, disregarded, right? So the further removed from being considered the norm you are, the more marginalized your experience becomes, the more silenced your voice becomes, the more distant you become, the more violence you might experience in a system. And so how then are these norms maintained? That's something to really pay attention to, right? Like, how do we continue to know that a cis, het, white, able-bodied, attractive, neurotypical XYZ man is the norm? And it's really through the isms. It's really through that second green, that darker green ring, or that second ring from the middle. Ableism, racism, discrimination, classism, transphobia, all those different isms are really keep us in line with knowing who's considered the norm and who's not. And so it's really important to think about then the relationship that someone might have being far removed from being considered the norm and have to engage with different systems. So for instance, let's think about what happens to someone who is not considered the norm, who has to engage with the criminal legal system or the prison system. What will happen? What will happen to someone who is not considered the norm, who is experiencing the education system, or is working through capitalism, or is engaged in the immigration system, or has to, navigate the immigration system? They might be immediately under scrutiny. Absolutely, Jack. What else? Not seen as credible. Thank you, Laurie. What else? They're ignored, maybe not given the benefit of the doubt, might experience self-doubt while maneuvering through those systems, absolutely. Might have to jump through more hoops and hurdles, might get dismissed, right? So to think about the fact that there's an overrepresentation still of Black men and of Black trans people in the prison system. To think about then the level of violence or the intersecting levels of violence that a Black trans person will experience in the prison system. The fact that some people are sitting in jail simply because they can't afford a cash bond system, but otherwise would be out. Like, we have to think about that. The fact that Khalif Browder was a 17-year-old boy sent to Rikers Island for allegedly stealing a book bag. And there are other folks out here who have literally shot and killed people and are out in the street or in GB, right? To think about what that means when someone is given credibility, someone is given credit and grace simply because they represent the norm, while other folks are not, or assume, or thank you, Mary, automatically assumed to be guilty, right? And that pretty quickly leads us into really thinking more about intersectionality, which is one of my favorite things to talk about. So intersectionality is a term that was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, another great theorist to get to know. But it's really what she said, it was a framework designed to explore the dynamics between identities and what she called connected systems of oppression. So the relationship between race, class, and gender, with patriarchy, white supremacy, and capitalism, for instance. And Audre Lorde says there is no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives. And so I'm gonna stop sharing because I have a couple quick video clips that I want us to watch. We'll go ahead and watch them back to back, and then we can unpack them a little bit together in the chat or when folks take themselves off of me. But we're gonna go ahead and watch them. They're available on YouTube. If you actually type in #race and, you can pull them up. Or if you go to raceforward.org, which is a really great resource, I love them, you can also find those clips there. So I'm gonna mute.
My name is Ariel Newton. I am the founder of BlackMillennials.com. I'm also an organizer with Black Lives Matter New York City. Race and gender, race and sexuality. I am Black. I'm also a woman. I'm also queer. That means that I have to deal with racism, patriarchy, and homophobia. We have to be comfortable and clear that we're not playing oppression Olympics. It's just recognizing that these various systems of oppression are going to work to marginalize some folks more than others. To them, I say they are uncomfortable with the depth of existence. I think they're hiding behind their fear. I think they hide behind the fear of recognizing even when they perpetuate certain things. So, for example, white feminists get very upset when Black feminists are like, no, we're not gonna be all women. We're gonna say that Black women, Indigenous women are oppressed more than white women. And if you're uncomfortable with that, then that means that you're not fighting for all women to begin with. Ultimately, that's what makes our battle stronger, if we can recognize and be more comprehensive in how we go about advocating when we understand that folks are intersectional beings. Our oppression doesn't all look the same. Our oppression is determined by what we look like, what we sound like, where we grew up, where we went to school, if we went to school. And that's why it's important that as we try to dismantle oppressive systems, that we're clear that some folks are oppressed more than others. We have seen, primarily even within Black liberation struggles, some of these oppressive behaviors repeat themselves. Black women and Black transgender people are often erased and silenced, their labor co-opted by dominant heteronormative ideals. We have to unlearn these behaviors and ultimately understand that these behaviors came by way of white supremacy. So if we're clear that our oppression, the ways that we perpetuate oppression within our own community, we can better achieve racial justice. Sometimes I say that I put my Blackness before my womanhood, or I put my Blackness before my queerness, and I'm trying to unlearn that compartmentalizing of my being. My entire being is what informs how I navigate the world, how I respond to injustice, how I promote justice. It's hard for people to be complicated or to recognize complication. Folks like things easy. Today I'm going to say no more. Today I say that I am a full human being, and my humanity is wrapped up in a lot of different layers and tiers and so many different things. And that's beautiful. It should be celebrated, although it might be more difficult to understand.
I'm Jamia Wilson, Executive Director of Women Action and the Media. Race and gender, race and disability, race and class. Intersectionality is something that I think about every day because I'm living it. And I also think about what it means to show up in the world in my specific body with my specific experience and background. I am African American. I'm also straight. I am able-bodied except for the fact that I was born with a visual impairment, so I walk around with a disability that sometimes people can't see. I was raised in an upper middle class background, so I have class privilege. All of those things play into power, privilege, and marginalization that I experience depending on those different aspects of my identity. Even though race is a social construct and we know that genetically there is no such thing as race, it's this very powerful, powerful illusion that's been perpetuated and used to kill people. It's been used to justify war. It's been used to enslave people. It's been used to force people into indentured servitude. And to disregard that history is disrespectful to all the people who suffered and fought for me to be able to live closer to freedom today. When I am in feminist spaces, and sometimes I might be told that it's divisive for me to bring up race, that we need to focus on the issue at hand, which is gender. Or it might come up in a space where we're doing racial justice work, and I might be told by another person of color, well, this isn't an issue about your gender, this isn't an issue about race, and it doesn't matter what the gender issue is, race has to take priority and precedence in this issue. That's impossible for me to make a prioritization of various parts of my identity that are equally integral to who I am and that are inextricably connected. We want to make sure that we're not single-storying other people and that we aren't contributing to that, that people need to be able to show up as their whole selves, and that's better for us as a community and as a culture and a society. What I really want to ask people who ask me that question is, what part of your own internalized oppression or your own addiction to the drug that is privilege makes you fear full liberation for all people? There's a problem with even seeing this as divisive. There's a problem when we're not actually understanding that the liberation of all people makes us all free. When trans women of color are free, that's bringing me close to freedom. When Syrian refugees are free, that brings me close to freedom. It's really important for us to think about that, not to think about how we protect our own privilege with a structure that doesn't even work for us, but how do we create more openness and liberation for all human beings, for all humanity.
Sonia Ginasaka, migrant queer poet, culture organizer.
race and gender, race and immigration status, race and sexuality. Everything and every way that I'm negotiating my space and the way that I'm accessing space is in relation to how the United States of America is seeing me as this brown woman, as this foreign, as this migrant, as this person with an accent, as this person who's perceived femme or woman. I can come up here and identify as a white woman, but that is not the reality. In migrant spaces, we're fighting for immigration rights, getting that DREAM Act or getting that, CIR. Don't talk about, your reproductive rights, or don't talk about your queerness. Doesn't even take into consideration economic class, doesn't take into consideration how very English-centered it is. How are we fighting for immigration rights and most of your pamphlets are in English? Like, that doesn't make sense. And then in queer spaces, there's been the neglect to acknowledge immigration or even, undocumented status. And then in a general sense, my identity and as an artist and a poet, that is always erased in many spaces. We are always doing reactionary work and we're always doing, fighting against this or fighting against something. But when it comes to artists, we are always left behind. That's one of the reasons many of us burn out, because there's no recognizing all of our identities and showing up as whole beings and showing up as complicated individuals. In this country, what I've noticed is immigration reform has always been about the access to whiteness. Example, we have two borders. Which border is racialized? Which border is more militarized? Which border exists within racial coded language? That's usually the Mexican border, right? And there's this myth of that there's a border right with Canada. Many movements that are advocating for undocumented communities, they're always leaving out Black migrants. Look at all the campaigns, look at even the posters. There's one sort of depiction of immigration and migrants that is very coded under who is now deemed acceptable to kind of uplift white supremacy or whiteness or a certain identity of citizenship in this country. So, and that's many brown communities. There's the reason why there's anti-Blackness within migrant spaces and non-Black people of color spaces. There's always going to be a policy that is going to be shifted. But at the core of it, non-white bodies are always going to be seen as quote-unquote illegal or as not having any legality in this country. All of my identities are intertwined. I think that having to negotiate with any of them is not gonna take us anywhere to the journey of liberation or radicalness or progressiveness that we are actually trying to do. If anything, is the erasure of what has led us here.
Lady Dane Figueroa Aditi, performance artist, goddess, ancient jazz priestess of Mother Africa. Race and gender, race and class. So I'm a Black, Indigenous, Cuban, Nigerian, American woman who's trans. I'm the daughter of an immigrant. I come from the ghettos of Baltimore. People have to understand what all of the histories of all of those identities in order to understand really my positionality within the world. There are poor Black people, there are rich Black people, there are Black cis women, there are Black trans women. And so intersectionality is telling us that we have to discuss race in particular, right? Because that's the topic that I'm using. If we're talking about race, that we have to talk about it in its full scope. Yes, we are sharing an experience because, for example, two Black people, we are sharing this experience because we're both Black, but I'm a Black trans woman. And so numbers don't lie. And we all know that Black trans women in particular are some of the most marginalized in our community and the most affected by structural oppression. There's this concept that we are all given the same opportunities, but it's not true. If we look historically and we talk about, this idea of pulling yourself up by the bootstraps, Black people actually did pull themselves up by their bootstraps. But we then have places like Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921. There was thriving Black neighborhoods, Black people buying from Black businesses, owning Black businesses, investing in Black businesses. And that's what they're told. All you have to do is be rich and nobody can ever hurt you again. All you have to do is buy into the system and move upward and you'll be safe. What then happened was their white neighbors would then come and literally commit acts of genocide. And so now today, right, we have people who could have had old money who are now poor. And so what is that psychologically saying to these people? That when you thrive, when you succeed, you're still not safe. And so we're talking about race and class, and we're not understanding the history of race and class as it presents itself in America in particular, because that's where we're living, right? And we're having a fool's conversation. If someone comes to me and they say to me, you are creating differences, I would say, no, that's actually not true. Because in my indigenous cultures, people who were different were still essential to society. Within European cultures, particularly within the rise of patriarchy and the way that it manifests through religion, is that differences little by little were no longer celebrated and they were stamped out. And the one thing that structural oppression gives us that we should all aspire to generally is of a cis, het, white man. So when we're talking about intersectionality, right? I'm always being an intersectional being because I'm all of these things always at once. If you're having a conversation with me and you're not having a conversation understanding that I come with all of those identities within the conversation, then how are we supposed to move forward?
Thank you, friends. So feel free to add your comments to the chat. We'll talk about it if we have a little bit time towards the end, talk about those videos a little more. But I love this meme, I guess it is. It says, use caution when describing barriers. Being Black is not a barrier for me. White supremacy is the barrier. Being female is not a barrier for me. Patriarchy is the barrier. Name the systems of power. Those are the barriers. And so as you all do more social justice work, racial justice work, victim-centered, trauma-informed work, we definitely want to make sure that we're not placing the blame on people's identities and really putting the focus on how these systems have been created to, again, marginalize some folks over others. And a really important thing to remember, we're going to get into allyship a lot more next week, but one really important thing to remember when you're doing any type of allyship, advocacy work, whether it's cross-community allyship work even, to remember that people are complex. Whatever identities they hold are meaningful to them. Think about your own identities that are valuable and meaningful to you and what makes you a whole person. And that it's really important to celebrate those things as well and not just say, oh, we can, work through a one-size-fits-all approach, because that does not work. Especially when we think about intersectionality, especially when we think about Black womanhood and the many different ways Black women show up in the world. We want to definitely make sure that we're tailoring services as much as possible so that people get the things that they actually need and that are meaningful to them. Also, quick reminder, about power dynamics and how power play sometimes shows up inadvertently in our work. So although we go into domestic violence or anti-violence or any type of healthcare work with best intentions, we still operate from a place of privilege and power when working with survivors. The power dynamics that come with being deemed an authority is something to pay attention to. You cannot exert power and expect to empower. And with that, also thinking about allyship more is to recognize even when you do fit the archetype of the norm. So even if you are a cis, het, attractive, college-educated, home-owning white male, does not mean that that's something negative. You can definitely use that and leverage your power and leverage whatever privilege or access you have to really stand up and support people as well. So I definitely want folks to understand, even when you show up as close to the norm or closer to the norm than other people might, doesn't mean it's a bad thing. You can use that to leverage your power and really support other folks in the community as well. And so that gets us into thinking about microaggressions, where this should be sort of wrapping us up. But microaggressions have been defined as brief and commonplace, often daily, verbal, behavioral, or environmental indignities, whether intentional or unintentional, that communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative slights and insults to a target group or person. And microaggressions show up in a couple of different ways. So we have microassaults, which are usually much more conscious and intentional actions or slurs, such as using racist language, displaying swastikas, hanging nooses, really thought of as like old school racism. So my example of a microassault, I went to a predominantly white high school, and every now and then, some of the students would decide it's a great idea to hang nooses throughout the school. So again, the fact that it was a predominantly white high school, there were very few people of color and very fewer Black people, and to hang nooses was like definitely a microassault. They knew it was intentional. It was very intentional. It was very conscious, and really sort of like that old school racist mentality, right? Micro insults and micro invalidations usually show up a little differently, but they still have very deep and very real impact. So micro insults are verbal and nonverbal communications that subtly convey rudeness and insensitivity and demean a person's racial heritage or identity. So my quick example, my best friend, beautiful dark-skinned woman, growing up though, she would constantly hear people tell her, "Oh, well, you're pretty for a dark-skinned girl." Now, that's not actually a compliment. It's actually very much rooted in white supremacy. It's very much rooted in colorism, even when it was coming from other people of color, very much rooted in colorism, which is like the preferencing of lighter skin tones and more Eurocentric features for people of color. And that exists in all communities as well. I just have to say that. But that was a micro insult. Something I've heard plenty of times is, "Oh, Ayana, you're really pretty, but you look even better if you lost weight." Now, I'm fine whatever weight I am, and I'm very confident in that fact. But again, that doesn't actually have to do with me. It's not actually a comment, and it's actually really rooted in fat phobia and fat shaming. I saw Sherry put a comment, "How much did they Jew you down?" This was actually said in a conversation they were in, right? So like making these sometimes very passive comments. Some people wouldn't even pick up on it. Some people would think, "Oh, it's just a big, what's the big deal? Why are folks being so PC all the time?" But really it's a micro insult. And so micro invalidations can sometimes show up differently as well, where they're communications that subtly exclude, negate, or nullify the thoughts, feelings, and experiential reality of someone who's been marginalized. So I remember I was in a workspace with a really great white ally friend of mine, Kristen, and she's allowed me to tell the story. But we had someone in leadership, and we were talking about bringing in more diversity into the workplace, because like I was the one Black girl she was the one lesbian, and that was like all the diversity that they had, right? And so we went up to leadership. We're talking about what does diversity actually look like? What are the different ways we can bring it in? And our leadership turned to her and said, oh, well, I guess you are a type of diversity now, aren't you? Right? So that's a micro invalidation, just completely like invalidating her lived experience as a queer woman and like writing it off as just like an afterthought. Like that was a micro invalidation. Another thing that could happen, and I'm sure folks have heard it or experienced it or seen it, where a friend might come up to you, or you might see a friend come up to you and say, oh, I just had this really negative and I think racist experience with so-and-so. And instead of fully and deeply listening, the person will respond, well, I've known them for 10 years. I really don't think they're racist. Maybe you're just being a little sensitive. I really don't think they meant it that way, right? And like completely negating the actual lived experience that that person just had. So micro-invalidations show up in some interesting ways as well. And I saw some other comments come through that I want to make sure I elevate. Oh, right. So even comments like, oh, did they jip you? And that's really like a slur towards, sorry, my comments are going crazy. It's really based on a slur. Let's see. Yeah, I'm trying to think. But yeah, a lot of great comments. Thank you all. So again, there are a lot of different ways that micro insults, micro invalidations, even micro assaults can show up, but it's important to think about and really be able to recognize, even be able to recognize that it's very impactful and they have long lasting impacts towards the people that they're directed at. And then again, they show up in different ways. So we have verbal, which are messages that are obviously communicated through words. But then we have behavioral and nonverbal as well, which are messages communicated through our action or inaction. That's a big thing as well. Our body language, eye contact, touching of hair. So even think about it. When you go to your doctor and you're telling them your story, you're telling them about their aches and pains, and they say, yeah, I believe you, but they sit back and they cross their arms. What is that? Like, what type of messaging is that giving you? Right? So to think about how things like that can show up. And environmentally as well, so messages that are communicated through the layout, design, and setup of spaces in which we work, access services, pray, inhabit, etc. So my example, when I was working in shelter, our director did have the great thought to do some redesign, make it more lively, make it more homey feeling in the shelter. So she picked a color blue that she really enjoyed. She didn't ask for any staff input, which I thought was flawed in her plan. But she went ahead to pick this blue. She ended up painting the entire shelter this blue color. When it was on one wall, it was really nice. It was really beautiful. But by the time the entire shelter was painted this blue color, it actually felt very institutionalized in there. It felt very much like a jail. And so we then had survivors coming into shelter saying, oh man, it feels like a jail in here. Oh man, it feels like a mental house in here, right? So to think about how sometimes intent versus impact, like that's sort of why we need to think about microaggressions, because someone might say something and they totally mean it as a compliment. I've had plenty of people literally come up and touch my hair and tell me how beautiful it is, and still it was a microaggression. So some other key concepts that we're not going to go into too much, but we will talk about we'll talk more about mental health next time. We're also going to talk about a lot more about allyship and cross-community engagement next time as well. But some other key concepts to think about: anger and shame, and how Black women were automatically labeled angry, but we're not really given the space to explain why we might be angry and like have our anger actually validated. Mental health and trauma. Black communities historically have not had the space to talk about our mental health, to talk about the trauma that we've experienced. So I'm going to go ahead and we'll delve into that a lot more next time. We also have to think about the impact that carceral punishment has had, or carceral feminism, as that's sometimes called, where it was the whole notion of, well, if you lock abusers up, survivors will automatically be safer. But we've come to know, and really Black women in leadership had been saying for a long time, that does not make people automatically safer to lock folks up. It's going to have some deeper and sometimes more impactful outcomes. There's also a difference between trust and rapport. We can talk about that a little bit more when we get to our advocacy portion next time. Also thinking about the impact that colorism and Eurocentric standards of beauty have had on Black women, have had on communities. The whole difference between, can we look at Black women as victims, survivors, true victims? How does the language come up? Really narrowing in on fear and the impact and the real live impact that fear has on folks. The necessity of representation and inclusion. And then again, looking at microaggressions and implicit bias as well. And so I have some discussion questions. I'm gonna stop share just so I can see folks who might be on screen. But I wanted us to start with some of these questions. Let me go back and pick which ones I want to do. So let's start with this first question. What is the purpose of exploring someone's intersecting identities, and does it really matter? And I'll put that in the chat. So what's the purpose of exploring someone's intersecting identities, and does it really matter? And feel free to take yourselves off of mute. Go ahead, Sherry.
Well, I think that it shows us how many ways we're alike, and that nobody is one thing, which I think is really important. We all have so many things that define us, but it also could look at someone that visually you say, like, I don't have anything in common with, and find out you have so many things in common with. And all of those things make up who we are. And then I think one thing about intersectionality that I'd like to throw on there is experiences. So you have all your other things, but you're also carrying around the experiences that you've had in your life to add to that pile.
Yeah, thank you. I saw some comments come through. Carol said building trust and empathy. Absolutely. Mary said acknowledgement and giving space of difference, giving space for difference, or even celebration of difference. It's okay to celebrate that we're different. That's all right. Sometimes, again, like Sherry was just saying, you might look at someone and say, oh, or assume you might not have anything in common with them. And then you get to know them, and maybe you don't have anything in common with them, but maybe they're just a really interesting and cool person, right? Other thoughts? I see Allison says allowing people to have complex experiences, feelings, existences. Absolutely. Negotiating and disregarding any part of our identity will not move us forward and limits us from connecting with others if we don't acknowledge our differences and identities. Yes, Shelby, I agree. Other folks, you can take yourselves off of mute. Jack says it's also just nice to be real and fully witness the person in front of you. I agree. It's really great to know a whole person, right? And not just like how they've compartmentalized who they are as people. There was another comment. I think it is how we learn, and I can learn more about myself, knowing more about you. Absolutely. And it's really interesting to think about and again, celebrate difference and uphold difference and learn about different lived experiences in community, right? I was talking to one of my really great friends, Jess, who's from Ohio, who's from like a not very diverse community. And we're really great friends and we're really different. And she tells me about her farm life. Well, I had no concept about that before. And I tell her about Baltimore City culture and what we do down here in Maryland. And we love crabs and all that, right? So you can still celebrate with people even when you're very different. Let's see, it helps to really see someone and validate their experience. It matters because it brings to light the ways we experience our own culture, our culture due to their intersecting identities and how they experience power and oppression. Absolutely. And again, it really is about how do we see someone as a whole person, not only see them as a whole person, but then really make sure that we're showing up for them in the way they need us to show up and not in the way that's comfortable or safe or familiar to us. Because what a Black trans woman might need might be different from what I need as a cishet queer woman who has a lot of privilege in society to be able to negotiate different spaces, right? And so, again, different lived experiences, maybe some similarities there, but we can still act and stand for each other as allies and as advocates. Another comment. I see a comment, for me personally, it matters a lot when people talk about and acknowledge my intersecting identities, because it shows me that all those parts of myself are important, and they recognize that my identities are integral to the way I experience and move through the world, as well as influence the way I respond and see options available to me and choose to move forward. Absolutely. Jack says it helps tease individuals out of oppressive structures and regimes of truth. Sherry wants to put in a plug for all the employee resource groups that are available to staff, faculty, and students. They can be, you can find info on ohsu, a great way to connect and learn. All right, let me ask another question because I have one. Okay. How will you, how have you, will you, or can you respond to someone who says that we are all the same and everyone should be treated the same? So how have you, can you, or will you respond to someone who says we are all the same and everyone should be treated the same? So maybe talk about equity versus equality. That's always a great way to start. Y'all got a lot of commentary. Hold on, let me go back up a little bit. The idea works to so maybe talk about how that idea actually shuts people down and really doesn't allow them to discuss differences, right? That's another way. Thankfully, we are not all the same. That would be boring. I very much agree. So maybe emphasize again the difference between equity and equality, and that you can treat people well and still recognize their differences. Acknowledge that it's a great sentiment, but the reality is that we must acknowledge and be transparent about our truths, about our lived histories. Let's see. So maybe saying in a perfect world where there aren't so many oppressive structures in place, maybe we all would be able to be treated the same, but right now that's not the lived reality. That's not the current reality. Yes, that's not the current reality. I think it's a great sentiment. Like, I understand why people say it. Like, I just want to view you as a human being. I just want to view you as a good person. That's great. And you can still say I'm a Black woman that's like boss and doing things. Like, I'll take that too, right? Like, it's okay to uphold difference. It's okay to celebrate that someone isn't exactly the same as you. It's okay to say that we've experienced life differently. Maybe I haven't experienced the same barriers, the same obstacles you have. Maybe you haven't experienced some things I've gone through, right? Get to know folks, really be open with each other and be open with community. And we will get into, next week, we'll get into a lot more around implicit bias, how to move past shame, and how it's like one of the most like irrelevant things that you can do when you're trying to do social justice work. And we'll talk about, again, more about cross-community allyship and how to have some tough conversations with folks that you're working with, folks that you're in community with, and again, how not to get caught up in that whole shame thing, because it's really a distraction. Let's see, any more questions I want to ask? Okay, so, and I'm gonna save some of these for some of these questions I have for next time. but here's one that I do want to ask before we end. How can you begin to leverage whatever power or privilege you might have to best support Black survivors or best support Black folk you're in community with? What are your thoughts? So someone said, shut up and lift up other voices that need to be heard, listen, learn more about their situations. What else? Speak up when I am benefiting unequally from a certain system. Make or maintain spaces for folks to be heard. Speak up when you hear microaggressions or when you observe microaggressions. Interrupt racism. And that's like, all of this is like really easy to say, right? Like it can be really uncomfortable and it can be really hard. It can be really tense sometimes. I know I've even had really tense conversations with some of my white ally friends of like, hey, I know you're an ally and I consider you a friend, and that thing you just did was really harmful too, right? Like all of those things can still be true in a space. Let's see. I think in order to maneuver around microaggressions, again, what we always say about survivors is that when someone tells you their truth, believe them. Just believe them and what they're telling you. It's okay to ask additional questions later, but the first thing folks need you to do is listen and believe. Apologize when harm has been caused. Honor folks' needs and desires. It's their life. We're just there for support in whatever way, in whatever capacity we're in. And so I do want to share my screen one more time just so you can get this list. So these are honestly just some of my favorite theorists, writers, scholars. I find them to be, because people always ask me, well, what resources can I use? And like, I honestly feel like this is where you should start first. Like these people are where you need to start. These writers, Black women, theorists, scholars, professors, short story writers, poets, they are oftentimes thought of as like the heartbeat for Black women. They're able to tell stories that Black women have not been able to tell, but they very much are our stories. And again, these are just some of my favorites. Audre Lorde, Octavia Butler, if you like science fiction, amazing work. Ntozake Shange, amazing. Patricia Hill Collins, one of my personal gurus, and I love her so much, and she doesn't even know. Yeah, just like all these people. And these are just really the Black American people. I didn't even get to like Black African, immigrant, Afro-Caribbean, Afro-Latinx folks. I didn't even get to them yet, but I always recommend to start here. And then my contact information. So my email is really the fastest and easiest way to get a hold of me. And then we can always get on a call later. I'm totally fine with that. Totally am collecting friends all across the country. So if you just want to be friends and have an ally across the country or need support or need resources, totally take my email and reach out to me. I'm gonna give you all a couple minutes intentionally to do some self-care because that was a lot that I threw at y'all, a lot of information, a lot of trauma stuff. But I want to go ahead and turn it over to Stephanie and first say thank you so much. I really appreciate you all being in space together and really holding this conversation up. And now I'm going to pass it to Stephanie. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. We really, really appreciate your time and coming to hold space with us. This was such an amazing presentation and we can't wait for part 2. So if folks haven't yet had an opportunity to register for part 2, we know that we had to shift schedules a little bit. So that section will be presented next Tuesday, same time at 10 a.m. I put the link to Eventbrite in the chat if you haven't already had access to it. I know there's a lot happening in there now, so you might have to scroll up to access it. I really want to, again, just take a moment to thank our speaker and Ujima for the work that you all are doing, and for really helping our community have an opportunity to learn more about misogynoir, better understanding the experiences of Black women and girls, and help to illuminate the work that particularly those of us who have access to privilege need to take on to learn about, to help illuminate, address the systemic barriers that perpetuate and support violence against Black communities and Black women and girls. I also want to thank our ASL and Spanish interpreters and our closed captioning transcribers for being with us today and helping to increase the accessibility of this webinar. Thank you all so much.
And go do your self-care for real. 10 minutes self-care, go do it. All right, see y'all next week. Thank you so much.